Hello and welcome to the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, and today, GDP, is it the right measure of a country's wealth, or is it downright misleading? And if so, is there a better way of seeing how an economy is doing? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast. Well, GDP is generally the measure that we use for the wealth of a country, or GDP per capita, perhaps. And that, in theory, can tell us how we're doing compared to some point in history or compared to other countries in the world. Obviously, we need to adjust it for inflation. But, Steve, as a comparative measure, is this the best measure we've got?
It's the best we've got, but it's not the best we should have. This is my problem with GDP, is that there's all sorts of fudges in GDP that actually mean it ends up measuring a large number of transactions which are not monetary transactions. Right. They're imputed monetary transactions. So, for example, the classic is if you live in your own home, what the statisticians then do is impute that you're actually paying yourself rent. So if you're living in a nice part of the south of England and you to rent a place you're in would cost £20,000 per year, then every property in that region that's owned by its owner is valued as if it's worth £20,000 per year in flow of accommodation services, and that's added to GDP. Now, no money actually changes hands. It's an imputed financial transaction.
Even the inclusion of housing is a bit of a concern, isn't it? Because as we've seen, overinflated house prices in many Western nations, that's pushing up the GDP, because of that imputed measure, is pushing up the value of GDP. But are we any better off for having an expensive house?
Well, no, in fact, those things don't turn up in GDP, but the cost of the imputed cost does. Yeah. But the actual elevated house price doesn't turn up there. But, of course, to buy the house, you can't buy the house with imputed money.
Well, it still relates. Doesn't that mean that the rent is going to be, the imputed rent is going to be higher if the house price is higher, presumably?
There is a relationship, but it's not all that strong. If rents control house prices, they'd be a lot lower than they are right now.
Yeah, okay.
But you've got a form of feedback between them. But if you think about what's going on here, when we buy houses, which are existing assets, and therefore because they already exist, they're not recorded in GDP. We use money to do that. So you can't buy an existing house without real money, but that's not counted in GDP. Whereas if you look at GDP itself, it does include this imputed rent, which nobody pays. So there's already two fictional elements. We ignore one major source of monetary transactions. We turn another one, which is non-monetary, into monetary. And there are other elements in there as well. They have the value of your computer is astronomically more than you paid for it, because what's actually computed is what's called a hedonic index, to say, well, how does this computer compare in terms of functionality to one that you had 20 years ago? And of course, the answer is the one you got now is far less functional than one you had 20 years ago, because of all the stuff-ups that Microsoft have done with Windows, make it less functional than a DOS computer 20 years ago. I'm being slightly facetious here. I frankly believe that. But of course, what's actually happened is the other way around. They value it, a PC now, which might cost,
a couple of $1,000.
Maybe even less than it would have cost 20 years ago. They value it at 20 times what you paid for it, because it can do so much more than the one 20 years ago, and they want to be able to make comparative stats over time. So there's at least three fictional elements in the way we measure GDP to begin with, and there's a fourth. The fourth is financial services, what's called the FIRE sector, finance and real estate. Now, this is a huge proportion of any economy these days. In the American economy, of course, at various times, profits of the FIRE sector were 50% of total profits. Now, how do you measure the output of the FIRE sector? And the way they do it is simply by adding up the wages. So the more, Lloyd Blinkenfeld, whatever he's called, or the guy who runs, Goldman Sachs, et cetera, the more they pay themselves, the more productive they're recorded as being in the GDP figures. So we actually, but if you have the attitude that Michael Hudson has to the scale of the financial sector, and that I certainly share, that it's well beyond the scale where it's necessary to provide credit for corporations and individuals, and it's now at the stage where it's parasitic, then I'd actually be wanting to deduct a lot of their so-called contribution to GDP from GDP, because it's a negative contribution.
Right. But, I mean, it is an easier measure. I mean, there's different ways of measuring GDP, isn't there? I mean, basically, we can do just that, look at how much we've earned, or the other way is to look at how much we spent. And that's where you start to get into all of those, assumptions that you have to make around that. I mean, isn't that part of the problem with GDP calculations? They are just so bloody complicated. And what would be the problem if we just looked at how much everybody earned, aggregated it? If somebody is paying themselves a ludicrous wage, won't the market see to that?
No, the market doesn't see to that because they're still paying themselves ludicrous wages a decade after they crashed the financial sector. So don't let the market system won't control there. In fact, it's relative power that sets those prices. And when you've got access to a bucket of money, it's pretty easy to set your own price. And that's pretty much what's happening in the banking sector. So you can't rely upon the market to get that right. But what you do have is I think, two important weaknesses in GDP. First of all these fictional elements that are added in, that's the whole idea of hedonic prices, the imputed rents, the wages to the finance sector in one instance. Then you have monetary transactions which don't turn up in our measurements of GDP because they're buying existing assets. So we're ignoring a large part of the monetary dynamics of the economy as well. And that's what I want to, my own analysis.
So eBay, for example, all of those where I'm buying something that somebody had and I'm buying secondhand. I mean, again, there's also what about, or bartering, so money not actually changing hands, you're just swapping something. We don't do too much of that these days.
It depends on whether a new product has been produced for swapping or not. So, again, there's a fair bit of, having rubbished the stats so far. On the other side, there's quite a bit of sophisticated work being done as to whether you classify output of a factory or output of a handicraft, operation as new goods. You don't include the ones which have already been sold. So there's lots and lots of checking of double counting. There's looking at value at different stages. So it's quite sophisticated.
And there is lots more to this conversation, digging down on how GDP is calculated and also questioning whether it's actually the right measure to use at all. To hear the full conversation, well, you need to subscribe at debunkingeconomics.com. You can choose one of the subscription plans in the right-hand column of the website, or you can support Steve Keen and his vital economic research on Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen, if you provide $10 or more support each month, then you'll get access to this and all the other podcasts in this series. So we hope you'll do that and see us back here very soon for the full edition of this podcast. I'm Phil Dobbie. Thanks for listening.